And so we come to the final chapter in Solomon's little philosophy book, chapter 7, Philosophy, Happiness, and the Meaning of Life. And we see that Solomon casts philosophy as what he calls the great accompaniment. That is, philosophy by itself doesn't produce anything of marketable value. As the cynic has often said, philosophy bakes no bread. But as a very, very wise man once said, man does not live by bread alone. Once a person has engaged in philosophical reasoning, once a person has attempted to tackle these timeless and very difficult and very important questions, these big non-empirical questions that we've attempted to think through, they're never quite the same. From then on out, they are much more reflective, more thoughtful, and their life is ever more rich because of it. Now, what does it mean to live a life that is meaningful? And is a meaningful life necessarily a happy life, and is a happy life necessarily a meaningful life? Consider a life that enjoys lots of wealth, or perhaps fame. Would a person who is rich and famous necessarily be living a meaningful life? Solomon argues no. It's not the case that if you simply have money and lots of people know who you are, your life is necessarily meaningful. You could have a very shallow and meaningless life, and have lots of money and lots of fame. Rather, to live a meaningless life, I believe Solomon attempts to articulate, entails living a life in which we somehow give back to the rest of mankind. We somehow are able to enrich the lives of others. We somehow are more deliberate and more thoughtful in our own life choices and our own life path. It's a life that's less flippant. It's a life that's more cerebral. It's a life that's consciously lived. It's a life of cognition, of planning, of reflection. I think I've said reflection several times so far. Maybe it's the case that Solomon is biased, since he's a professional philosopher, to articulate a meaningful life along with perhaps the way many philosophers live their lives. And maybe this life is one in which fame and fortune are unnecessary and perhaps shunned and looked down upon because philosophy, again, isn't that marketable by itself. And so we might consider how Solomon might be biased in his description of a meaningful life. But in any case, that's a question for you to decide. What does it mean for your life to be meaningful? How can it be more meaningful? Surely you want that to be the case. But for it to actually come about, you need to think about what that would mean and then articulate some sort of a plan that would enable you to actually live that life. Don't just sit back and wait for life to make itself meaningful. Take the driver's seat. Make it meaningful for yourself. Now, Solomon argues that you simply don't want a life of happiness, because if that were the case, you'd be happy to perhaps sit around and inject yourself with morphine all day. But of course you don't want to do that. Similarly, you would most likely reject Robert Nozick's experience machine. That's the machine described there toward the end of the chapter, the theoretical machine, that would simulate life experiences for you. And so you could step into this machine and it would tap directly into your brain, directly into your consciousness, such that you believed you were living the life of a rock star or a president or a celebrity or whatever. You can design your own fantasy. And from your perspective, life would be very, very enjoyable. But you would know going in that this wouldn't actually be your life. This would be a facade. It would be fake. Solomon argues that the vast majority of people that would reject this, and that this indicates that there's more to living a meaningful life than simply having a happy life. However, I think that in 2013 we can say that the prevalence of people who live online lives, the prevalence of people who not only engage in tweeting and Facebooking and that sort of thing, but what I'm really talking about are the people who live dual lives in some sort of a online world. The World of Warcraft is the only one that I'm vaguely familiar with, but I understand there are thousands, if not tens and hundreds of thousands of people who spend a great deal of their time living in those lives and a great deal of their money supporting those lives. And I assume that those lives are more enjoyable, more meaningful, perhaps from their perspective, than their actual lives in what I would consider, and I think you would consider, the real world. So maybe it's not the case that we prefer to live an actual life with actual accomplishments. Maybe it's the case that many people would prefer a much more happy and exciting life that is altogether false than a more mundane life that is altogether real and genuine. But my challenge to you is to make your actual life the exciting and meaningful life that you envision. To not be afraid to take chances, to not be passive and expect life to become meaningful for you, but to instead to think about what your goals are, what your aims are, what your values are, where you'd like to be 1, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, and then actually act on those goals, actually bring that life about. As far as we can tell, we only have one, so let's make it the most meaningful, the most enjoyable, the best life it could possibly be. Thanks so much for your attention. I hope you've enjoyed this book, and I look forward to discussing the next book with you.